My daughter canceled my 68th birthday dinner 37 minutes before she was supposed to arrive. I was standing in my Boston kitchen beside the cake I had baked from scratch when Emily said almost casually, "Mom, I have to go to Margaret's birthday brunch instead. Jason's family will all be there." Then she laughed softly and added, "Please don't make this emotional. Margaret needs me more tonight." I stared at the empty chair at my dining table long after the call ended. 3 hours later, while my daughter toasted her glamorous mother-in-law in Manhattan, I boarded a private flight to my $14 million villa in Tuscany, and Emily had absolutely no idea it existed. If you've ever felt replaced by your own children, I want you to tell me in the comments. And please let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every message because stories like this remind us we're not as alone as we think. And if emotional family dramas touch your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these journeys together. People assume loneliness arrives all at once, like a lightning strike, like a funeral, like waking up to an empty side of the bed after 50 years of marriage. But that isn't how it happened for me. Loneliness came slowly, quietly, politely. It arrived in canceled lunches and shortened phone calls, in birthdays forgotten until the next morning, in hearing my daughter sigh impatiently whenever I talked too long about old memories she once begged me to repeat. By the time I turned 68, loneliness had become so woven into my daily life that I barely recognized it anymore. My name is Heidi Sanders. I live in a brownstone townhouse in Beacon Hill, Boston, where autumn leaves collect on the sidewalks like old letters nobody bothers to read anymore. I've lived there for nearly 30 years. I raised my daughter Emily in that house. Every inch of it still carries traces of her childhood. The pencil marks on the pantry door where I measured her height every birthday. The tiny burn mark on the kitchen counter from when she tried to make pancakes alone at 13. The loose stair railing her father kept promising to fix before cancer took him too quickly. Some mornings I still reach for my husband Robert in bed before remembering he's been gone for 10 years. After he died, Emily became my entire world. I know mothers aren't supposed to admit that. People say it's unhealthy, that children should grow up free from emotional responsibility. Maybe they're right. But when you spend decades pouring every piece of yourself into one human being, it becomes impossible not to feel their absence like missing skin. I raised Emily mostly alone even before Robert passed. He traveled constantly for work while I rebuilt damaged Renaissance paintings for museums and private collectors. Most people thought art restoration sounded glamorous. It wasn't. It was long hours hunched over cracked canvases beneath harsh lights, while breathing chemicals that made my hands ache at night. It was missing dinners, missing sleep, flying across Europe for clients while trying to rush home in time for school recitals. But I did it gladly, because Emily never had to wonder if the electricity bill would be paid. She never wore secondhand shoes. She attended the best schools Boston could offer. And every Christmas morning, no matter how exhausted I was, there were gifts under the tree and cinnamon rolls warming in the oven before sunrise. Emily used to adore me. When she was little, she'd crawl into my lap and play with my hair while I worked on restoration sketches at the dining table. "You're the prettiest mommy in the world," she used to whisper. I can still hear her tiny voice sometimes. Back then, it was always us against the world. Until Jason Carter entered the picture. At first, I liked him. He was polished, ambitious, confident in the way young corporate attorneys often are. Emily met him at a charity gala in Manhattan during her marketing internship. He sent flowers after their first date, opened doors, remembered birthdays. After years of bad boyfriends who borrowed money and forgot anniversaries, Jason seemed like an answered prayer. But then I met his mother, Margaret Whitmore. Even now, saying her name leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Margaret belonged to the kind of old money social circle that treated kindness like a weakness and elegance like a weapon. Everything about her was immaculate. Her silk blouses, her perfect silver blonde bob, her posture straight enough to balance a champagne glass on. The first time we met was at a restaurant overlooking Central Park. I remember arriving 5 minutes early only to discover Margaret had already seated everyone, including Emily, but not beside me. Margaret sat at the center of the table like a queen arranging her court while I was placed near the end beside Jason's distracted uncle, who spent most of dinner checking stock prices on his phone. "Oh, Heidi," Margaret said with a bright smile when I arrived. "I hope you don't mind. Emily always sits beside me at family dinners now. We've become inseparable." Emily laughed softly, actually laughed, as though it were sweet, as though she hadn't once cried at summer camp because she missed sitting beside me at dinner for 5 days. I should have recognized the warning signs then. But mothers are experts at self-deception. We convince ourselves that small hurts are meaningless because the alternative is too painful to face. After the wedding, things changed faster. Emily started missing our weekly Sunday breakfasts. Then birthdays became rushed coffee visits squeezed between important obligations. Then holidays rotated increasingly toward Jason's family because Margaret hosted better events. That was Emily's phrase, not mine. Better events. Apparently, my homemade apple pie and candlelit Thanksgiving dinners couldn't compete with private chefs and imported orchids. One December, Emily canceled Christmas Eve at my house because Margaret had arranged matching family pajamas for a professional photographer. "You understand, right, Mom?" she asked over the phone. "It's important for appearances." Appearances. I nearly dropped the phone when she said that. Because I hadn't raised Emily to care about appearances. Or at least, I thought I hadn't. Still, I kept making excuses for her. She's busy. Marriage is complicated. New families take adjustment. I repeated those lies to myself the way lonely people repeat prayers. Then came the afternoon that finally cracked something open inside me. I was meeting Emily for lunch in Manhattan after not seeing her for nearly 2 months. I arrived early at the restaurant, and the hostess accidentally seated me near a partially closed private dining section. That's when I heard Margaret's voice. "Oh, honestly," she said lightly, "Heidi is perfectly nice in a provincial sort of way. But Emily has outgrown all that emotional dependence." The women around her laughed softly. My chest tightened. Margaret continued sipping wine as though discussing weather. Some women simply remain small their entire lives. Heidi never understood how society works. Emily does now. I stood frozen behind the divider curtain. And then my daughter spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, but quietly enough to break my heart forever. "She means well," Emily said. "But sometimes she can be emotionally exhausting." I felt physically cold. I cannot fully explain that moment unless you've experienced hearing your child become a stranger while you're still standing close enough to touch them. I left before Emily saw me. I sat in a taxi afterward, staring out at Manhattan traffic while my hands shook in my lap. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the old locked drawer in my study. Inside was a leather folder. Inside the folder were documents Emily had never seen. Documents connected to a life I had deliberately hidden from everyone around me for more than 20 years. A life in Tuscany. A life worth $14 million. And as I sat alone in my silent Boston townhouse, I realized something painful. Maybe my daughter had spent so many years overlooking me because I had taught her I would always remain standing there, waiting. My 68th birthday fell on a Thursday. Boston was wrapped in one of those cold October rains that make the entire city smell faintly of wet brick and chimney smoke. The kind of weather that usually made me feel cozy, safe. Not that year. That morning I woke before sunrise with the strange nervous excitement only mothers still carry long after their children become adults. I told myself not to expect too much. Emily was busy. Jason traveled constantly. Life was complicated. But she had promised she'd come, and promises still mattered to me. I spent the entire day preparing dinner, even though there would only be 3 of us: Emily, Jason, and me. I made Emily's favorite meal from childhood herb-roasted chicken with garlic mashed potatoes and honey-glazed carrots. The same dinner she used to request every birthday until she turned 25 and suddenly became too sophisticated for comfort food. I baked the chocolate cake from scratch. Not because I had to, because mothers remember things nobody else does. We remember favorite frostings, the songs our children hummed at 6 years old, the way they liked their sandwiches cut diagonally instead of straight across. Love lives in details. By late afternoon, my townhouse smelled of butter rosemary and warm cocoa. Candles flickered across the dining room table beside the antique china Emily once begged me not to use unless it was a special occasion. I even took out the old photo albums. There was one picture I kept staring at while waiting for them to arrive. Emily at age 8, sitting on the kitchen counter with flour all over her cheeks while helping me bake cookies. Her front teeth missing. Her grin enormous. Back then, I was the center of her universe. I wonder if children understand how terrifying it feels to slowly disappear from that place. At 6:15, I changed outfits for the third time. At 6:20, I reapplied lipstick. At 6:30, I checked the window every few minutes like a teenager waiting for a first date. And at 6:43, my phone rang. The moment I saw Emily's name, something inside me already knew. "Hi, sweetheart." I answered anyway, forcing brightness into my voice. There was noise behind her. Music, laughter, glasses clinking. "Oh my God. Mom." "I feel terrible," she said quickly, though she didn't sound terrible at all. Something came up. I closed my eyes. Something. Margaret moved her birthday brunch dinner thing to tonight because people are flying in from Connecticut tomorrow morning. She laughed distractedly. It turned into this whole event. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. "You're not coming." Silence. Then an irritated sigh. "Mom, please don't do that. Do what make me feel guilty." I looked slowly around the dining room. 3 wine glasses, folded linen napkins, candles burning lower by the minute. "You promised me," I whispered. Another pause. And then came the sentence that changed something permanently inside me. "Margaret needs me there more than you do." I honestly think my heart stopped for a second. Not because of the words themselves, because of how casually she said them. Like it was obvious. Like a mother who raised you alone through illness, grief, debt, and sacrifice could somehow rank beneath a woman who hosted charity galas and wore diamonds to brunch. In the background, I heard Margaret's voice faintly calling Emily's name. Then laughter. Then jazz music. Emily lowered her voice slightly. "Jason's entire family is here. I can't just leave." "You could," I said quietly. Her tone sharpened immediately. "Why are you doing this? It's one dinner." "No," I replied. "It's my birthday." "Oh my God, Mom." That exhausted little laugh again. That laugh hurt more than shouting would have. "I'll take you somewhere next week, okay?" she said. "Please don't make this emotional. Please don't make this emotional." I think daughters forget mothers are human beings. That we feel humiliation too. That rejection burns at 68 just as sharply as it did at 16. I stared at the rain sliding down my kitchen windows. Then I heard another voice through the phone. "Margaret, well, tell Heidi we missed her." The women nearby laughed softly. Emily laughed too. Something cold settled over me then. Not rage, not even sadness. Clarity. I spoke very calmly after that. "You should get back to your party. Heidi." "Enjoy your evening, sweetheart." And before she could answer, I hung up. The silence afterward felt enormous. The kind of silence that presses against your chest until breathing becomes difficult. I stood motionless in my kitchen for nearly 5 full minutes. Then very carefully I blew out the candles on my own birthday cake, one by one. The house suddenly looked foolish. Pathetic almost. Like a stage set for a play where none of the actors arrived. I sat alone at the dining table afterward, staring at the untouched food growing cold between empty chairs. That was when I finally allowed myself to cry. Not graceful tears, not cinematic tears, the ugly kind. The kind that come from years of swallowing hurt until your body physically cannot contain it anymore. I cried for Robert, for the young mother I used to be, for every excuse I'd made for Emily, for every moment I convinced myself love simply required more patience. Outside, rain hammered the windows harder. At some point, I looked toward the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. I looked old. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone who had spent too many years asking for scraps of affection from people who should have offered love freely. That realization changed everything. Around 9:30 that night, I walked upstairs to my study. The room still smelled faintly of old books and cedarwood. Robert's favorite armchair remained beside the fireplace exactly where he'd left it a decade earlier. I crossed to the far wall and opened the bottom drawer of an antique mahogany desk. Hidden beneath insurance papers and tax folders was a small brass key. My hands didn't shake anymore. I unlocked the old safe behind the bookshelf and removed a leather portfolio tied with cream-colored ribbon. Inside were property deeds, Italian banking documents, photographs, and one picture that always stopped my breath. A golden villa resting beneath the Tuscan hills at sunset. Terracotta roofs glowing amber. Rows of vineyards stretching endlessly beneath the Italian sky. Villa Belladonna, worth $14 million. A place Emily had never seen, never heard about, never imagined existed. For 22 years, I had protected that secret carefully. Not because I was ashamed of it, because I was afraid of what money did to people, especially family. I sat at my desk for a very long time holding those documents while thunder rolled outside over Boston Harbor. Then slowly I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly 6 months. Lucia Bellini answered on the second ring. Heidi, her warm Italian accent, filled the quiet room. Madonna, is everything all right? I looked once more at the untouched birthday dinner downstairs. Then at the photograph of Tuscany in my hands. And for the first time in years, I made a decision entirely for myself. I'm coming home, I whispered. There are women who destroy families loudly, and then there are women like Margaret Whitmore. Women who do it with perfect posture and a champagne smile. The frightening thing about Margaret was that she never appeared cruel in public. She was too intelligent for that, too polished, too practiced. She destroyed people gently, like someone slowly tightening invisible strings around a puppet until it no longer remembered how to move on its own. 3 years earlier, before Emily's wedding, I almost convinced myself Margaret and I could eventually become friends. I truly did try. I attended every bridal appointment she invited me to, even when I could clearly tell she wanted me there only for appearances. I complimented her hosting, sent flowers after her charity events, thanked her for including me. But from the beginning, Margaret treated me less like Emily's mother and more like an embarrassing distant relative who'd somehow wandered into the wrong country club. One afternoon during wedding planning, Emily invited me to Margaret's estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Estate. That's the only word for it. The property looked like something from an old East Coast magazine, spread white stone exterior, massive iron gates, manicured gardens so perfect they barely seemed real. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lilies and expensive candles. Margaret greeted me wearing cream-colored silk and pearls at 2 p.m. "Heidi, darling," she said airily, while kissing the air near my cheek. "You found the place." Found the place, as though I'd navigated a jungle. Emily immediately rushed toward me holding fabric swatches. "Mom, wait until you see the floral designs Margaret picked." Not we picked, Margaret picked. I noticed those details constantly. The subtle transfers of authority. Margaret led every conversation, while Emily followed eagerly behind her like a student desperate for approval. Throughout lunch, Margaret dominated the table effortlessly. She discussed investment portfolios, European travel, political fundraisers, private schools. The entire time I barely spoke because there was never room to. Every subject became another performance where Margaret displayed her sophistication while Emily watched admiringly. At one point, Jason casually mentioned my career. "You know, Heidi restored Renaissance works in Italy for years," he said. Margaret's eyes shifted toward me instantly. For just a second, something sharp flickered beneath her smile. "Italy," she repeated smoothly. "How fascinating. I nodded politely. A long time ago. But where exactly mostly Florence? How extraordinary, she said, softly studying me now with a new kind of attention. And yet Emily says you live such a quiet life. The comment sounded harmless, but it wasn't. Margaret always spoke in layered meanings. Quiet life, meaning small, unimportant, ordinary. I smiled anyway. Quiet can be peaceful. Margaret tilted her wine glass slowly. Sometimes, she replied, people confuse peacefulness with lack of ambition. Emily laughed awkwardly. Jason stared at his phone. And just like that, I understood something important. Margaret was not merely judging me. She was measuring me. After lunch, Emily pulled me upstairs to see wedding invitation samples, while Margaret stayed below with event planners. The moment we entered the guest suite, I finally whispered, "Does she always talk like that?" Emily frowned immediately. "Like what?" "Like everything is a competition." Emily sighed dramatically. "Mom, you're being sensitive again." Again. That word hit me harder than it should have. "She's trying to help us build connections," Emily continued. "Jason's family moves in very different circles than we do. We, not you. We." I stared at my daughter carefully. "Emily," I asked quietly, "are you ashamed of where you came from?" Her eyes widened instantly. "What? No." But she answered too quickly. "The truth about shame is that people rarely confess it directly. It leaks out sideways. In corrections. In distancing. In the sudden desire to reinvent yourself around wealthier people." Emily spent her childhood eating takeout Chinese food on our living room floor while helping me sort restoration sketches. She used to wear paint-stained jeans and sing loudly to old Fleetwood Mac records while cleaning the kitchen. Now she discussed social positioning over imported tea. Sometimes transformation happens so gradually, you don't realize someone is disappearing until they're already gone. The deeper Emily entered Margaret's world, the more she began editing herself. Her clothes changed first, then her voice, then her priorities. Eventually, even her laughter sounded different, sharper, more careful, like she was always performing for an invisible audience. Margaret encouraged all of it. "No daughter of mine would ever wear polyester," she once joked during a shopping trip while Emily laughed beside her. "No daughter of mine." I stood 3 feet away when she said it. And somehow, Emily never noticed how much those words hurt. Or perhaps she noticed and simply stopped caring. Still, the worst moment came nearly a year after the wedding. Jason's law firm hosted a holiday gala at a luxury hotel in Manhattan, and Emily insisted I attend. "You never come to anything anymore," she complained over the phone. So I went. I bought a new black dress, had my hair professionally styled, even wore Robert's favorite sapphire earrings, though they made me emotional. For the first hour, everything seemed pleasant enough. Then I got lost looking for the restroom. The ballroom connected to several private lounges through long velvet corridors, and I accidentally turned into the wrong room while searching for signs. That's when I heard Margaret speaking. "Emily has done wonderfully," she was saying. I froze immediately. The room door remained slightly open. Several women sat around her holding champagne glasses while soft jazz floated through the suite. Margaret crossed her legs elegantly. "Frankly, I worried in the beginning," she continued. "Heidi is perfectly pleasant, but she's terribly provincial." The women chuckled politely. "She lacks refinement," Margaret added. Emily needed guidance, exposure, a stronger example. My stomach tightened. Then another woman asked, "Does Heidi resent your relationship with Emily?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Oh, Heidi's lonely. Women like that cling emotionally to their children. But Emily understands now that adulthood requires elevation." Elevation. I'll never forget that word. Because in Margaret's world, love was hierarchical. Human value depended entirely on status. And somehow my daughter had started believing it too. Then came the sound that truly shattered me. Emily's voice. Soft, amused. "She means well," Emily said. "But honestly, sometimes, Mom can be emotionally exhausting." The room laughed lightly. I couldn't breathe. Not because strangers mocked me, because my daughter allowed it. No, worse. She participated. I backed away from the doorway before anyone saw me, my chest burning so painfully I thought I might collapse right there in the hallway. But as I turned, I caught one final sentence from Margaret. "I do wonder what Heidi's hiding, though," she murmured thoughtfully. Nobody spends years in Florence around private collectors without learning how to conceal things. I stopped cold. Every instinct inside me sharpened instantly, because Margaret said that sentence too deliberately, too knowingly, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. Margaret had been investigating me. The realization followed me all the way back to Boston. For weeks afterward, I replayed her words over and over in my head. What exactly did she know? Had she discovered something about Tuscany, about Sofia De Luca, about Villa Belladonna? I told myself it was impossible. The property existed under Italian legal protections arranged decades earlier. Very few people even knew it belonged to me. And yet, Margaret Whitmore had the instincts of a predator. And predators could smell weakness, or wealth. Sometimes both. The more I thought about it, the more one terrible truth became unavoidable. Margaret hadn't separated Emily from me accidentally. She'd done it strategically, slowly, patiently. And now, sitting alone in my Boston townhouse after my canceled birthday dinner, I finally asked myself the question I should have asked years ago. If Margaret already suspected I was hiding something valuable, what would happen once she discovered exactly how valuable it really was? I never intended to become wealthy. That's the truth nobody believes once they hear the number. $14 million sounds like ambition, like greed, like strategy. But Villa Belladonna entered my life through grief, loyalty, and a kind of love I no longer believed existed. 22 years earlier, before Emily married Jason, before Margaret Whitmore ever entered our lives, before loneliness settled into my bones like winter frost, I lived a very different version of myself. Back then, I still traveled constantly for restoration work. I was 46 years old, exhausted all the time, and trying desperately to keep my marriage alive while balancing motherhood and a demanding international career. Florence became my escape. There's something about Italy that softens damaged people. The light there feels older somehow, warmer, as though history itself breathes through the stone streets. I first met Sofia De Luca during one of the worst periods of my life. Robert had just started chemotherapy. Emily was applying to colleges. And I was quietly drowning beneath medical bills while pretending everything remained manageable. Then a private restoration request arrived through a museum contact in Rome. The client was described only as an elderly noblewoman with a significant family collection. That noblewoman turned out to be Sofia De Luca, the Countess of Belladonna. She was 78 when we met, sharp-tongued, brilliant, completely impossible to intimidate. I still remember arriving at Villa Belladonna for the first time. The estate sat high in the Tuscan hills surrounded by vineyards and olive groves stretching endlessly beneath the sun. Cypress trees lined the private road leading toward the villa like silent guards protecting old secrets. I had never seen anything so beautiful in my life. The villa itself dated back nearly 400 years. Terracotta roofs, stone archways, fresco ceilings faded softly with time. Entire rooms filled with Renaissance paintings most museums would have killed to display. And all of it slowly decaying. Humidity damage, cracked varnish, mold beneath ancient frames. Sophia's late husband had neglected restoration for decades before his death. "You Americans always look shocked when you see old beauty dying," Sophia told me during our first meeting as we stood before a damaged 16th century painting. "Europeans understand that decay is part of survival." I smiled politely. Then I spent the next 8 months proving her wrong. I worked 12-hour days inside that villa. Some mornings I climbed scaffolding before sunrise while drinking espresso so strong it practically stripped paint from my throat. Other days I sat for hours repairing microscopic fractures with brushes fine enough to paint individual eyelashes. Sophia watched me constantly. At first I assumed she didn't trust me. Later I realized she was lonely. Very lonely. Her only son had died years earlier in a boating accident near Sicily. Her daughter-in-law remarried quickly afterward and moved to Argentina with the grandchildren. Visits became rare, then non-existent. By the third month, Sophia began insisting I join her for dinner every evening. She'd drink red wine while questioning me endlessly about America, marriage, motherhood, art, politics. "You love too hard," she told me one night, unexpectedly. I laughed softly. "Is that supposed to be criticism?" "Yes," she replied immediately. "Women who love too hard teach people to take them for granted." At the time, I thought she sounded cynical. Now I think she was trying to warn me. Sophia understood people frighteningly well, especially weakness. One rainy evening, after a particularly brutal phone call from the hospital about Robert's declining condition, I broke down crying alone in the restoration room. I thought nobody heard me, but suddenly Sophia appeared silently beside me carrying 2 glasses of wine. She didn't offer sympathy, didn't offer comfort. Instead, she sat beside me, staring at the damaged painting in front of us. "Love is not proven by sacrifice alone," she said quietly. "Otherwise, the women who suffer most would all be adored." That sentence stayed with me for decades, because deep down, I knew she was right. I spent so much of my life believing endurance automatically created value, that if I loved enough, gave enough, waited long enough, eventually people would cherish me the same way I cherished them. But human beings don't always reward devotion. Sometimes they simply grow accustomed to it. Over time, Sophia became family to me in ways I never expected. When Robert died 2 years later, she flew to Boston despite her age just to attend the funeral. Emily was 16 then. I remember Sophia standing beside me after the service while snow fell across the cemetery. "She has your heart," Sophia said quietly while watching Emily greet guests. "Pray she does not inherit your loneliness too." I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. For nearly 15 years, I continued working with Sophia's collection seasonally, while Emily built her adult life in America. Then one winter morning, Lucia Bellini called me from Italy crying. Sophia had suffered a massive stroke. I arrived in Tuscany 40 hours later. By then, Sophia could barely speak. The once commanding woman who terrified diplomats and auction houses now lay fragile beneath white linen sheets, overlooking the vineyards she loved. Still, when she saw me enter the room, her eyes sharpened instantly. "Heidi," she whispered. I took her hand carefully. "You came." "Of course I came." Lucia quietly left us alone afterward. Sophia studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "You are the only person who never wanted something from me." Tears burned my eyes immediately. "That's not true." "It is." Her voice trembled weakly now. "Everyone else wanted status, access, money, titles." She squeezed my fingers faintly. "You cared whether the painting survived." I couldn't answer, because grief was already beginning to close around my throat. Sophia died 3 days later, just before sunrise. And a week after the funeral, her attorney requested a private meeting. I assumed it concerned cataloging the art collection. Instead, the attorney slid legal documents across the table. "Heidi," he said carefully, "Countess de Luca amended her estate 6 years ago." I frowned in confusion. Then he smiled softly. "She left Villa Belladonna to you. I honestly thought there'd been some mistake, but there wasn't." Sophia had transferred ownership entirely. The villa, the surrounding vineyards, the private art collection, everything. I remember sitting there unable to breathe while Tuscan sunlight spilled across the office floor. "She considered you family," the attorney explained gently. I cried harder that day than I had at Sophia's funeral. Not because of the money, because someone had seen me fully, valued me fully, perhaps for the first time in my life. But from the beginning, I made one decision very carefully. I would not tell Emily. Not then. not later. Maybe that sounds cruel now, maybe dishonest. But I knew what sudden wealth did to people. I'd watched families destroy themselves around inheritance battles during years working with collectors and estates. I wanted Emily to build a life based on character, not expectation. So I kept Villa Belladonna hidden behind layers of legal privacy and quiet discretion. Even in Boston, I continued living modestly. Same townhouse, same car, same routines. I never touched most of the estate's wealth, except for maintenance and preservation. Because somewhere deep inside me, I still believed relationships stayed pure only when money remained absent. Sitting alone in my study after my canceled birthday dinner, I finally understood the tragic irony. I had spent 22 years hiding my wealth to protect my daughter from greed. And somehow, I lost her to greed anyway. The morning after my birthday, Boston looked gray and exhausted. Rainwater streaked the townhouse windows while traffic crawled sluggishly through Beacon Hill below. Normally, I would have spent Friday mornings cleaning up after dinner guests wrapping leftover cake slices for Emily to take home, replaying conversations in my head with the bittersweet happiness mothers carry after family visits. Instead, untouched food still sat in my refrigerator. 3 place settings remained on the dining table because I hadn't found the emotional strength to clear them yet. There is something uniquely humiliating about cleaning up evidence of people who never came. I stood in my kitchen holding Emily's favorite cake server for nearly a minute before finally placing it carefully back in the drawer. Then I went upstairs and began packing for Tuscany. Not dramatically, not impulsively, quietly. That surprised me most. I thought a decision this large would feel explosive somehow, emotional, reckless. Instead, it felt calm, like finally setting down a heavy suitcase after carrying it too long. I packed slowly that morning. Cream linen dresses, soft cashmere sweaters, comfortable walking shoes for the vineyards, Robert's old photograph that always traveled with me, and finally the leather portfolio containing the Villa Belladonna documents. At 11:30, my phone buzzed. Emily. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. Hi, sweetheart. Her voice sounded distracted immediately. Hey, Mom. Sorry I didn't call earlier. We got back late. We. Always we now, never I. I folded another sweater into my suitcase carefully. It's all right. I felt bad about yesterday, she said, though she didn't sound particularly bad. Margaret's event turned into this huge networking thing for Jason. She kept asking where I was whenever I stepped away. I closed the suitcase zipper slowly. Something about that sentence suddenly irritated me, as though Margaret Whitmore now required supervision over my daughter's movements. Emily continued talking quickly. But Jason and I want to take you somewhere really nice next weekend to make up for it. Make up for it. Like missing your mother's birthday at 68 could be compensated with reservations and wine. I won't be here next weekend, I said calmly. A pause. What do you mean? I'm traveling. Where I looked out the window toward the rain-covered streets of Boston. Italy. Emily laughed softly in surprise. Italy. Since when? Since this morning. Mom? What? It's been planned for a while. I lied gently. Another silence followed. Not concern, not curiosity. Calculation. I could hear it. How long are you staying? I'm not sure yet. Well, she hesitated. Who are you going with? Nobody. You're traveling alone. Yes. Emily sighed immediately, slipping into the same tone she used whenever she subtly implied I was becoming old and fragile. Mom, that sounds exhausting. I almost smiled. Funny how women my age become fragile only when younger people want control over our decisions. I'll manage. Well, text me the hotel information at least. Hotel. For one brief, dangerous second, I nearly told her everything. Nearly said, actually, sweetheart, I'm flying to a private Tuscan estate with vineyards older than America itself. A villa you've never seen because I spent 22 years trying to raise you without entitlement. But I stopped myself. Instead, I simply said, I'll be fine. After we hung up, I stared at the silent phone in my hand. Not once during that entire conversation had Emily asked if I was all right emotionally. Not once had she asked why I suddenly decided to leave the country alone less than 12 hours after spending my birthday abandoned. She only wanted logistics, control, information. That realization hurt more than the canceled dinner itself. By late afternoon, I was on my way to Logan Airport. The city blurred past the car windows, while autumn rain washed Boston into watercolor shades of gray and amber. I watched familiar streets disappear behind me and felt something strange settling inside my chest. Not grief, relief. I hadn't realized how emotionally exhausted I'd become until the decision to leave removed the pressure of waiting. Waiting for Emily to prioritize me. Waiting for her to remember who we once were. Waiting for love to return to something recognizable. Maybe Sophia DeLuca had been right all those years ago. Women who wait endlessly for affection eventually disappear inside the waiting itself. My private charter departed shortly after sunset. As the plane lifted above the Atlantic coastline, I looked down at Boston glowing beneath clouds and suddenly remembered another flight many years earlier. Emily had been 9. It was her first time traveling internationally with me to Florence during summer break. She spent the entire flight curled against my arm, asking endless questions about Italy. "Will the buildings really be older than America?" she whispered excitedly. "Yes." "Will there be real castles?" "Yes." "Can I eat pasta every day?" I laughed softly at the memory. Back then, Emily loved adventure, loved simplicity, loved me. Somewhere over the Atlantic, tears finally slipped silently down my face. Not dramatic tears, quiet mourning, the kind that arrives when you realize you've spent years trying to preserve a relationship already slowly dying. I slept only briefly during the flight. Most of the night I sat wrapped in a cashmere blanket staring into darkness while replaying moments from Emily's childhood. Her tiny hand gripping mine on the first day of kindergarten. The way she used to run into my bedroom after nightmares. The terrible year after Robert died when she crawled into bed beside me every night because neither of us could sleep alone. How had we become strangers? Was it Margaret Jason Money? Or had I unknowingly raised Emily to believe I would always forgive anything? Near dawn, the plane crossed over the Tuscan countryside. Golden morning light spilled across rolling hills, stitched together with vineyards, olive groves, and narrow dirt roads winding between ancient stone villages. Even after all these years, Italy still stole my breath. The moment we landed in Florence, something inside me loosened. The air smelled different there, earthier, warmer, like life moved according to older rhythms untouched by social climbing and curated appearances. A black car waited outside the private terminal, and standing beside it was Lucia Bellini, older now, smaller somehow, but still carrying the same gentle eyes that had comforted me through Sophia's funeral decades earlier. The moment she saw me, she pressed both hands over her mouth. "Heidi." I stepped forward and she wrapped her arms around me tightly before I could speak. No performance, no obligation, just genuine affection. And God help me. I nearly broke apart right there in the airport parking lot, because I'd forgotten what unconditional warmth felt like. Lucia held my face carefully between her weathered hands. "You look tired," she whispered. I laughed shakily. "That obvious to people who love you." "Yes." The drive to Villa Belladonna took nearly an hour through winding Tuscan roads lined with cypress trees and vineyards, glowing bronze beneath the autumn sun. As we approached the estate gates, emotion rose suddenly in my throat. Home. Not Boston. Not the townhouse filled with waiting. This place. Villa Belladonna appeared exactly as it always had, golden stone walls illuminated beneath morning light ivy climbing ancient archways. Vineyards rolling endlessly beyond the hills. Beautiful. Steady. Untouched by rejection. Lucia smiled softly while the gates opened. "She missed you," she said quietly. And for the first time in years, I realized something important. Maybe I had spent too much of my life begging to be loved by people who had forgotten my value, while entirely ignoring the places where love had been waiting for me all along. The first morning I woke up at Villa Belladonna, I cried before I even opened my eyes. Not from sadness, from silence. Real silence. No traffic outside the windows. No distant sirens. No vibrating phone waiting to disappoint me with another delayed response from Emily. Only the soft rustling of olive trees beyond the terrace and the faint sound of birds somewhere in the vineyards below. For years, my life in Boston had become emotionally claustrophobic without me realizing it. Every room carried expectation. Every weekend carried hope. Every unanswered message carried hurt. But Tuscany asked nothing from me. That first morning sunlight poured through the linen curtains in long golden streams across the bedroom floor. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old stone warmed by the rising sun. I lay there for several minutes simply breathing, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my chest didn't feel tight. Lucia insisted on preparing breakfast outside on the eastern terrace overlooking the vineyards. Fresh figs, warm bread, local honey, espresso strong enough to wake the dead. "You are too thin," Lucia announced immediately while piling food onto my plate. I laughed softly. "You said that 20 years ago too." Because it was true 20 years ago too. Some things never change. Antonio Bellini arrived shortly after breakfast carrying fresh flowers from the village market. He was Lucia's grandson now, 32, broad-shouldered and kind-eyed, with the same quiet warmth that seemed woven naturally through the Bellini family. "Heidi," he greeted me with genuine excitement. Finally, the villa feels alive again. Alive. That word stayed with me all morning, because somewhere over the past decade, I had stopped feeling alive myself. I'd become functional instead, reliable, available, a woman permanently waiting beside the phone for crumbs of affection from people too distracted to notice her loneliness. Antonio spent the afternoon walking me through recent vineyard renovations while I slowly reacquainted myself with the estate. Villa Belladonna was breathtaking in autumn. The vineyards stretched endlessly across rolling hills, painted in gold, amber, and deep rust-colored reds. Olive trees shimmered silver green beneath the sunlight. Ancient stone fountains trickled quietly through the gardens Sophia once loved. Everywhere I looked, beauty existed without performance. Nothing here needed to prove its worth. I found myself thinking about Margaret Whitmore constantly while walking those grounds. Margaret would hate this kind of beauty, not because it lacked luxury, because it lacked audience. Villa Belladonna wasn't designed to impress strangers at cocktail parties. It wasn't curated for photographs or social status. It was intimate, historic, soulful, the kind of place that revealed character instead of masking it. Late that afternoon, I wandered into Sophia's old library overlooking the western vineyards. The room remained almost exactly as she'd left it. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, faded Persian rugs, antique globes, and the scent of leather and cedar drifting softly through the air. I sat in her favorite chair beside the fireplace and suddenly missed her terribly. Sophia would have understood everything happening with Emily. Not judged me, not pitied me, simply understood. That kind of understanding becomes rare as women age. People stop seeing us as complex human beings. We become mothers, grandmothers, widows, background figures, invisible. Maybe that's why losing Emily's affection hurt so deeply, because she was the last person whose love still made me feel fully seen. Around sunset, Lucia announced that several neighbors planned to stop by with wine for my birthday. I told them no big celebration. I protested immediately. Lucia waved dismissively. In Italy, people ignore instructions when love is involved. By 7 o'clock, the courtyard glowed beneath hanging lanterns, while laughter drifted warmly through the evening air. Nothing extravagant, just real. Antonio grilled fresh seafood, while Lucia argued loudly with neighboring women over whose family produced the best olive oil in Tuscany. An elderly vineyard owner named Carlo brought homemade wine older than some marriages. 2 local musicians arrived carrying guitars and began playing soft Italian songs beneath the stars. And somehow, these people celebrated me more sincerely than my own daughter had in years. Nobody cared about appearances. Nobody measured status. Nobody treated affection like currency. At one point during dinner, Carlo raised his wine glass toward me. To Heidi, he declared proudly in accented English, "The woman who restored beauty wherever she went." Everyone cheered. I laughed, embarrassed. But tears stung my eyes unexpectedly. Because when was the last time anyone had spoken about me with warmth instead of obligation? Later that evening, Antonio insisted on taking photographs throughout the celebration. At least one smile for social media, he teased, while adjusting his phone camera. "I look exhausted," I complained. "You look happy," Lucia corrected firmly. That stopped me cold. Because she was right. I was happy. Not performatively happy. Not politely happy. Actually happy. For the first time in years. So I let Antonio take the photographs. Pictures beside the vineyards at sunset. Pictures laughing with Lucia beneath lantern lights. Pictures sitting beside the infinity pool wrapped in a cream shawl, while Tuscany glowed gold behind me. And somewhere between glasses of wine and old Italian songs drifting through the courtyard, I completely forgot how dangerous happiness can become once other people notice it. The next morning, I woke to 23 missed calls, every single one from Emily. My stomach tightened immediately. Confused, I reached for my reading glasses and checked my messages. Then I saw the reason. Antonio had posted photographs from the birthday dinner online the night before. Nothing excessive. Just beautiful images of Via Belladonna glowing beneath lantern lights with the caption, "Celebrating the return of our beloved Heidi Sanders to Tuscany after too many years away." The post had exploded overnight. Hundreds of comments, shared repeatedly, and in every photograph behind me stood undeniable proof of extraordinary wealth. The infinity pool overlooking the vineyards, the historic architecture, the private wine cellar, the antique sculptures. Even someone completely unfamiliar with European estates could tell Villa Belladonna wasn't merely expensive. It was generationally wealthy. I stared at the screen for several long seconds before my phone rang again. "Emily," I answered slowly. "Hello, Heidi." Her voice sounded breathless. "Mom, where are you? Interesting. Not, are you okay? Not, why didn't you tell me? Just, where are you?" "I told you," I said calmly. "Italy." "No, I mean," she hesitated. "That place in the pictures." I looked out the terrace doors toward the vineyards below. "It's called Villa Belladonna." Silence. "Then you own that." There it was. Shock, confusion, and beneath both, something else. Something colder. I closed my eyes briefly. "Yes. How long have you owned it?" "A long time." Another silence. This one heavier. "Mom." Emily laughed nervously now. "Jason is literally losing his mind over these photos." Of course he was. I could already imagine him zooming into backgrounds, estimating square footage, researching Italian property values online. "What exactly is this place?" Emily asked carefully. I considered lying, considered minimizing everything. But suddenly I was tired of shrinking my life to make other people comfortable. "It's my home," I said quietly. And for the first time in years, I think my daughter finally understood there were entire parts of me she had never bothered to know. Over the next 48 hours, my phone transformed from silent to relentless. Emily called repeatedly. Jason began texting. Even Margaret Whitmore reached out personally for the first time in almost 6 months. It would have been amusing if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. For years, I could barely convince my daughter to answer a Sunday phone call. Now suddenly, everyone had time for me. Because wealth has a way of making people emotionally available. The first real conversation happened the morning after the photographs spread online. I was sitting beneath the pergola overlooking the vineyards with a cup of espresso when Emily called again. This time I answered on the second ring. "Mom." Her voice sounded softer than usual. Too soft. "I've been worried about you." I looked slowly across the hills glowing gold beneath the Tuscan sunrise. "Worried. Interesting word. You didn't seem worried on my birthday." A painful silence followed. Then Emily exhaled quietly. I know I hurt you. The old version of me would have melted immediately hearing those words, but Tuscany had already started changing something inside me, not hardening me, clarifying me. There's a difference between hurting someone accidentally and repeatedly choosing them last, I replied calmly. Emily became quiet again. For a moment, I almost heard the daughter I used to know breathing on the other end of the line. Then the conversation shifted, subtly, carefully, but unmistakably. So, she said lightly, how long have you owned this villa? There it was. Not, are you lonely there? Not, are you happy? Not, why didn't you tell me you were hurting the villa? Always the villa. A long time. Mom? Jason looked up the area online. That estate has to be worth… She stopped herself awkwardly. I mean, it's incredible. Mm-hmm. And you never told me. I traced my finger slowly along the rim of my coffee cup. No, I said quietly. I didn't. Why? That question carried more emotion than anything she'd asked so far. Not sadness, offense, as though I had betrayed her by keeping part of myself private. I thought carefully before answering. Because I wanted my daughter to love people for who they were, I said softly. Not for what they owned. Emily inhaled sharply. That's not fair. Isn't it? Her tone tightened immediately. You're acting like I care about your money. I didn't answer. Sometimes silence forces people to hear themselves more clearly than arguments ever could. Mom, seriously, Emily continued, you hid an entire life from me. An entire life. That phrase stayed with me long after the call ended. Because maybe she was right. There were entire parts of me Emily had never known. But then again, had she tried? For years, our conversations revolved around her schedule, her marriage, Margaret's social events, Jason's career plans. She stopped asking questions about me long ago. People only discover hidden parts of you when they care enough to look. That afternoon, Jason called directly. Now that surprised me. Jason rarely contacted me independently unless birthdays or holidays required politeness. Heidi, he said warmly the moment I answered. Wow. Tuscany looks unbelievable. I almost smiled. Straight to business. Thank you. I've actually worked with a few international property clients in Italy, he continued casually. That area is extremely exclusive. Mm-hmm. So is the estate family-owned through a trust. There it was. Not even pretending anymore. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Why are you asking? Oh, no reason, Jason laughed lightly. Professional curiosity. Professional curiosity. Funny how greed always disguises itself as practicality among wealthy people. I'm on vacation, Jason. Right, of course. Another pause. Emily's upset you kept this hidden. I imagine she is. She feels embarrassed. That word made me sit upright immediately, embarrassed. Well, Jason hesitated carefully. People are talking about the photos online. Margaret's social circle recognized the estate. Some are wondering why Emily never mentioned it. I stared across the vineyards stunned. Not because they cared about the villa. Because Emily's first emotional response was embarrassment over social perception. Margaret Whitmore had truly succeeded in reshaping my daughter completely. I see, I said quietly. Jason lowered his voice slightly. Look, Heidi, I think this could actually become a wonderful opportunity for family closeness. Family closeness. Interesting timing. For years, everyone assumed you preferred living modestly. But now that things are clearer, maybe there's room for a fresh start. Fresh start. Meaning now you are valuable enough to prioritize. The realization chilled me. Not because Jason hid his intentions poorly, because part of me still wanted desperately to believe these calls came from love. That evening, Margaret finally contacted me herself. Of course she didn't call. Margaret preferred performances. She sent a voice message. Heidi, darling, her smooth voice floated through my phone speakers. Villa Belladonna is absolutely extraordinary. I had no idea you possessed such impeccable European connections. Possessed. as though the villa were jewelry instead of memory. "You simply must allow us to visit while you're there," she continued warmly. "Emily seems emotional about feeling disconnected from this entire side of your life." I nearly laughed out loud. Disconnected. What a graceful way to describe years of neglect. Margaret paused before adding carefully, "And honestly, someone should help you manage such a substantial international asset at this stage of life." There it was. Finally. The first open glimpse beneath the mask. Not concern. Assessment. I replayed the message 3 times that night while sitting alone beside the infinity pool. The moon reflected silver across the water, while distant music drifted faintly from a nearby village celebration somewhere in the hills. Lucia found me there around midnight, wrapped in a blanket. "You are thinking too loudly," she said gently. I smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" To Italian women, always. She sat beside me quietly while crickets hummed through the warm night air. Finally, I handed her the phone. Lucia listened to Margaret's message once, then slowly removed her glasses. "That woman is dangerous." The certainty in her voice startled me. "You think so too?" Lucia looked toward the dark vineyards thoughtfully. "Some people hunger for beauty," she said softly. "Others hunger for ownership." A chill moved through me, because deep down I already knew she was right. The next morning, Emily called again. This time her voice sounded almost girlish, hopeful. "Mom." Margaret had an idea. Of course she did. "She thinks it would be amazing if we all came to Tuscany for a family visit." Family visit? Not reconciliation, not apology, a visit to the villa. I closed my eyes slowly. And why exactly would Margaret want that? Emily hesitated. "Well, she says families should share beautiful experiences together." Beautiful experiences. God. Margaret really did weaponize elegance better than anyone I'd ever met. I should have said no. A wiser woman would have refused immediately. But loneliness makes mothers dangerously hopeful. Part of me still believed maybe seeing Tuscany, seeing the life I'd hidden, might remind Emily who I truly was, beneath years of shrinking myself to fit into her new world. So instead, I heard myself say quietly, "You're welcome to come." Emily gasped softly. "Really, yes." Excitement flooded her voice immediately. Not emotional excitement, triumphant excitement. The difference mattered. "We'll look at flights tonight," she said quickly. "Jason's going to be so excited." Jason? Not "I miss you." Not "I can't wait to spend time together." Jason's excited. After we hung up, I remained sitting silently for a very long time. Then I reached for my phone once more and dialed another number. Daniel Russo answered immediately. "Heidi, I need you to come to Tuscany." His voice sharpened instantly. What happened? I stared toward Villa Belladonna, standing golden beneath the Italian sun. And for the first time, I admitted the truth aloud. "I think my daughter's family is about to try taking everything from me." The first thing Margaret Whitmore said when she arrived at Villa Belladonna was not hello. It was, "My God, this place must cost a fortune to maintain." Not beautiful, not historic, not peaceful, expensive. That told me everything I needed to know. I stood at the top of the villa steps watching the black SUV pull into the courtyard beneath the Tuscan afternoon sun. The vineyards shimmered gold behind them, while cypress trees swayed gently in the warm breeze. For one dangerous moment, seeing Emily step out of the car made my heart ache with hope anyway. She wore oversized sunglasses and cream linen clothing that looked deliberately chosen to match the Italian setting. Jason climbed out beside her, carrying an expensive leather duffel, while already scanning the property with sharp, assessing eyes. And Margaret stepped onto Tuscan soil like a queen inspecting newly conquered territory. She removed her sunglasses, slowly studying the villa with open fascination. Then she smiled. Not warmly, hungrily. "Heidi," she purred while air-kissing my cheek, "you truly buried the headline of the century." I smiled politely. "You made it safely." Emily hugged me next, though something about it felt performative. Too quick. too conscious of being observed. "I still can't believe this place is yours," she whispered while pulling back. There it was again. "Not I missed you." The villa remained the center of gravity in every interaction. Antonio helped carry luggage inside, while Lucia greeted everyone with polite restraint. I noticed immediately that Lucia disliked Margaret on instinct alone. Italian women trust intuition more than explanations. Margaret wandered slowly through the entrance hall, trailing manicured fingers across marble surfaces and antique furniture. "These frescoes are original?" she asked. "Yes. And the sculptures, 16th century. Margaret turned toward me with widened eyes. "Heidi, do you have any idea what these pieces are worth?" I almost laughed. Of course she would ask that first. Jason moved more subtly, but I watched him constantly. He paused near every painting, studied the architecture, asked careful questions about renovations, taxes, permits, staff land ownership. A lawyer performing due diligence disguised as casual curiosity. Emily floated somewhere between excitement and discomfort. I could tell she was overwhelmed by the scale of everything. Perhaps she was also trying to reconcile this powerful hidden life with the ordinary mother Margaret had trained her to see. That evening we dined outside beneath hanging lanterns while sunset painted the vineyards bronze and crimson. The table looked beautiful. Fresh pasta, local wine, candles flickering softly against ancient stone walls. The kind of dinner that should have felt intimate. Instead, it felt like negotiations. Margaret complimented everything excessively. "The architecture is divine. The air is magical. The privacy alone is priceless." Every sentence somehow circled back to value. Meanwhile, Jason casually asked Antonio questions about local property appreciation. "How stable is the Italian luxury market right now?" Antonio blinked in confusion. "I suppose stable?" Jason nodded thoughtfully. "And agricultural tax structures here." I took a slow sip of wine. "Jason," I said mildly. "Must we discuss taxes during dinner?" He smiled immediately. "Occupational hazard." Margaret laughed gracefully. "Oh, Heidi let the poor man be interested. This estate is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Not meaningful. Not emotional. Just extraordinary." The distinction mattered. Later that night, after everyone retired upstairs, I found Lucia waiting in the kitchen. She crossed herself dramatically the moment Margaret disappeared from sight. "That woman walks through rooms like she already owns them." I exhaled slowly. "You noticed too." Lucia snorted softly. "In Italy, women like her exist in every generation." She lowered her voice. "The elegant predators are always the most dangerous." Predators. The word unsettled me because it felt increasingly accurate. The next morning confirmed my fears further. I woke early and wandered downstairs before sunrise, hoping to enjoy coffee alone on the terrace. Instead, I found Jason already sitting there with his laptop open beside several printed documents. He looked startled when he saw me. "Heidi, you're up early. So are you." He closed the laptop slightly too fast. "Couldn't sleep." I sat across from him quietly while Lucia poured espresso. For a few minutes only, birdsong filled the silence between us. Then Jason spoke carefully. "You know, estates like this require complicated succession planning." There it was. Direct now. Not even hidden beneath social politeness anymore. I stirred sugar slowly into my coffee. "Do they?" "Absolutely. Especially international assets. European inheritance law can become messy if something happens unexpectedly." Something happens unexpectedly. Interesting phrasing for a man barely 40 years old, speaking to his elderly mother-in-law. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" I asked calmly. Jason leaned back smoothly. "Only that you should protect yourself." Protect. Funny how manipulative people always frame control as protection. Before I could answer, Margaret suddenly appeared wearing an ivory silk robe like a movie star descending into a scene she intended to dominate. "Heidi," she exclaimed brightly, "this sunrise is worth millions alone." Jason stood immediately to pull out her chair. I watched the interaction carefully. Margaret didn't merely influence Jason and Emily. She commanded them. People like Margaret don't build families. They build courts. Over breakfast, Emily became strangely affectionate. She touched my arm repeatedly, complimented my appearance, asked questions about my work in Florence decades earlier. At first glance, it almost looked like genuine reconnection. But something underneath felt rehearsed, like someone attempting intimacy after studying it from a distance. Then came the moment that truly shifted everything for me. Margaret glanced toward the vineyards thoughtfully before saying, "You know, Heidi, women our age must think carefully about legacy. Our age, as though we belonged to the same category of woman." I smiled faintly. "Must we?" "Oh, absolutely." She buttered toast delicately. "At some point, preserving assets becomes exhausting. Delegating responsibility is wise." Emily looked down at her coffee. Jason remained very still. And suddenly I understood something important. This conversation had been planned beforehand. Margaret continued smoothly. "Especially for someone living alone internationally." There it was. The implication beneath the elegance. Age. Vulnerability. Management. I set down my coffee cup carefully. Fortunately, I replied softly, "I've managed quite well alone for many years." Margaret's smile never faltered. "I'm sure you have. But eventually, everyone needs trusted family handling important matters." Trusted family. The phrase echoed unpleasantly in my mind. Because trust was precisely what had shattered between us. That afternoon, I walked the vineyards alone, trying to quiet the growing unease inside me. Tuscany still felt beautiful. But now tension moved beneath everything like an approaching storm. At sunset, Daniel Russo finally arrived. Seeing him instantly steadied me. Daniel had been my attorney for nearly 25 years and one of Robert's closest friends before his death. He was 69 now, sharp-eyed and calm, with the kind of grounded presence that made manipulative people nervous immediately. Margaret's expression tightened the moment I introduced him. "Interesting. Very interesting." "A lawyer," she repeated lightly over dinner. "How practical." Daniel smiled pleasantly. "Heidi asked me to review some estate matters while I was already in Europe." Lie. But a useful one. Jason became noticeably quieter afterward. Margaret, however, only grew more careful. That evening, after everyone retired, Daniel and I sat alone in Sophia's old library reviewing documents. I told him everything. The calls, the questions, the pressure disguised as concern. Daniel listened silently before finally removing his glasses. "They're circling the estate already," he said flatly. A cold feeling moved through my stomach. "You really think it's that bad, Heidi?" He looked directly at me. "People don't suddenly rediscover emotional attachment after seeing $14 million online." I closed my eyes briefly. Hearing it aloud hurt anyway. Daniel lowered his voice further. "From this moment forward, document everything." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Conversations, requests, suggestions, especially anything involving control over assets or your competency." The room suddenly felt colder. "You think they'll go that far?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the dark windows overlooking the vineyards. Then quietly said, the one sentence I still remember word for word, "Wealth doesn't create greed, Heidi. It reveals it." And deep down, I was beginning to fear he was right. The cruelest thing my daughter ever said to me happened 3 nights after arriving in Tuscany. Not during an argument, not in anger, but calmly, almost thoughtfully, which somehow made it worse. That evening began beautifully enough. The villa glowed beneath candlelight while warm wind drifted through the courtyard carrying the scent of rosemary and olive trees. Lucia prepared sea bass with lemon and herbs, while Antonio opened bottles from Sophia's private wine collection. To anyone watching from outside, we looked like a perfect family gathered in paradise. But tension had already started settling beneath every conversation like poison slowly spreading through water. Margaret spent the entire day subtly repositioning herself inside the villa as though rehearsing ownership. She criticized the kitchen layout, suggested vineyard modernizations, asked endless questions about staffing costs and estate maintenance. At one point, I overheard her speaking quietly to Jason near the library. The property has extraordinary long-term potential if managed correctly. Managed correctly. As though Sophia's beloved home were simply another investment portfolio. Meanwhile, Emily had become emotionally inconsistent in ways that exhausted me. One moment she acted nostalgic and affectionate. The next, distant and strangely defensive. I recognized the conflict inside her, even if she didn't. Part of her still loved me, but another part had already begun viewing me through Margaret's lens. As a resource, an opportunity, a woman whose value increased dramatically once money entered the picture. After dinner, we moved outside with wine while twilight settled softly over the vineyards. Daniel excused himself early, claiming exhaustion, though I knew he intentionally wanted to leave me space to observe the others without interference. Smart man. Margaret lounged elegantly beneath lantern light, wearing a cream cashmere shawl, while Emily scrolled through her phone beside her. Jason suddenly looked toward me thoughtfully. "You know," he said casually, "I still can't get over the fact that you kept this hidden for decades." There it was again. Not grief over emotional distance, not curiosity about my life, only shock that wealth existed without their knowledge. I smiled faintly. There wasn't much reason to discuss it. Emily lowered her phone immediately. "What does that mean?" I looked at her carefully. "It means the villa was private." "No," Emily replied sharply. "It means you didn't trust me." The accusation stunned me slightly. Trust. Interesting word from a daughter who skipped her mother's birthday for social appearances. Margaret reached over gently, touching Emily's hand. "Sweetheart, don't become emotional. Sweetheart." The intimacy of it scraped against my nerves. Emily ignored her and stared directly at me now. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this has been?" I blinked slowly. "Humiliating? Yes." Her voice tightened. "Everyone's talking about the photos. Jason's colleagues. Margaret's friends. People are asking why I never knew my own mother owned one of the most beautiful estates in Tuscany." There it was again. Not sadness. Embarrassment. Because appearances mattered more than honesty now. "I didn't realize my private life required public disclosure," I replied quietly. Emily laughed once. "Short, sharp. That's easy for you to say now." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Even the air seemed heavier somehow. Margaret remained silent, watching carefully. Jason leaned back in his chair, studying me with lawyer-like precision. And suddenly I understood something chilling. This conversation had been building for days. Emily's voice rose slightly. "You let me think you were struggling all these years." I stared at her in disbelief. Struggling. "You lived in the same old townhouse forever. You drove the same car for 15 years. You acted like—" She stopped herself. Like what Emily hesitated, then finally said it. "Ordinary." The word landed harder than shouting ever could have. Ordinary. I thought about the years I spent rebuilding Renaissance masterpieces while raising her alone after Robert's death. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the grief, the endless love. Ordinary. Margaret spoke softly, then her tone smooth as silk. "Emily's only upset because she feels excluded from a major part of your identity." Identity. Margaret always reframed greed into psychology. It was almost impressive. I looked directly at my daughter. "Would you have treated me differently if you'd known about the villa?" Emily opened her mouth immediately, then stopped. That silence answered everything. Jason stepped in quickly. "Heidi, nobody's accusing you of wrongdoing." "No, just emotional betrayal for failing to disclose assets, apparently." Emily crossed her arms tightly now. "All those years you watched me struggle financially while sitting on this." I felt something inside me go still. Struggle financially. "You know what I mean." "No," I replied calmly. "Actually, I don't." Emily's cheeks flushed. "We lived in a tiny apartment our first 3 years of marriage." I stared at her. "You lived in a luxury apartment in Manhattan with a doorman. That's not the point. You vacationed in Greece twice." "Mom." You spent $40,000 on your wedding flowers. That came from Jason's family. The words exploded out before she could stop them. Silence followed instantly. Then Margaret spoke carefully. Well, appearances do matter in certain social circles. And there it was. The truth beneath everything. Emily had started measuring suffering against wealthier people, against private jets, against estates, against Margaret's impossible standards. I looked at my daughter and suddenly saw someone deeply unhappy beneath all the designer clothing and curated sophistication. Someone permanently chasing approval. But instead of feeling compassion first, I felt heartbreak, because she no longer knew how distorted her thinking had become. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Emily stared directly at me and said quietly, "Margaret has been more emotionally supportive to me than you have in years." The world seemed to stop. Even the wind through the vineyards fell silent. Margaret immediately whispered Emily, but not because she disagreed, because she knew the sentence crossed a line. I looked at my daughter carefully. "Do you truly believe that Emily hesitated?" "Only briefly. Yes, I cannot fully describe what it feels like hearing another woman replace you in your child's emotional life while sitting inside a villa you spent decades hiding to protect that child from greed. It felt like mourning someone still alive." My throat tightened painfully, but I refused to cry in front of Margaret Whitmore. Instead, I asked quietly, "What exactly has Margaret supported you through?" Emily frowned. "She listens to me. So did I. She understands pressure. I worked through chemotherapy bills while raising you alone." "That's different." "No," I said softly. "It isn't." Jason intervened again before Emily could answer. "Look, everyone's emotional right now." "No, not emotional, revealed. That was the difference. Money had stripped away years of polite illusion. And now I could finally see what Emily truly believed about me. Not respected, not admired, useful. Useful when emotionally available. Useful when financially modest enough to remain non-threatening. But once wealth entered the picture, everything became transactional. Margaret shifted smoothly back into conversation. "Heidi, perhaps part of the issue is simply planning." She folded her hands elegantly. "Women in later stages of life deserve protection from overwhelming responsibility." Later stages of life. Protection. Responsibility. Every sentence carried the same hidden message now. You are aging. You need guidance. You should transfer control. I suddenly remembered Daniel's warning from the night before. Document everything. Quietly beneath the table, I pressed the recording app active on my phone. Then I looked directly at Margaret. "And who exactly do you think should manage my responsibilities?" Margaret smiled softly. "Trusted family, of course." Jason nodded slowly beside her. Emily looked uncertain now, and deep in my chest, something cold finally settled into certainty. This was never about reconciliation, never about healing. They hadn't come to Tuscany because they missed me. They came because they believed my age, my loneliness, and my love for my daughter would eventually make me surrender everything willingly. But for the first time in many years, I was no longer certain I intended to surrender anything at all. The papers appeared 2 days later. Not dramatically, not with threats or shouting. People like Jason and Margaret understood something important about manipulation. If you make exploitation sound responsible enough, decent people often cooperate willingly. That morning, Tuscany was wrapped in soft silver fog drifting through the vineyards like smoke. Lucia and Antonio had gone into the village market early, leaving the villa unusually quiet. I was in Sophia's old garden trimming roses when Jason approached carrying a leather portfolio beneath his arm. Immediately, my stomach tightened. There's a particular expression lawyers wear when preparing to present something unpleasant while pretending it's beneficial. Jason wore it perfectly. "Heidi," he said smoothly. "Do you have a few minutes?" I set down the gardening shears carefully. "Of course." We moved to the terrace overlooking the western hills where coffee had already been prepared. Jason remained unusually polite while arranging papers across the stone table. Too polite. That frightened me more than hostility would have. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other night," he began carefully. "And honestly, I believe everyone's emotions may have distracted us from practical realities." Practical realities. Another elegant phrase designed to disguise greed as responsibility. I remained silent. Jason opened the folder slowly. "These are preliminary estate management recommendations. Nothing aggressive. Just smart planning." The moment I saw legal headers I already understood: transfer authority, management oversight, protective structures. I'd spent enough years around wealthy collectors to recognize the language immediately. Still, I forced myself to appear uncertain. "I don't understand." Jason leaned forward gently. "Heidi International estates become complicated as owners age. Taxes, liability exposure, staffing oversight, succession rights." He smiled reassuringly. "This simply creates stability." Stability. Such a comforting word. The documents themselves were beautifully constructed. That was the dangerous part. No obvious theft. No blatant transfer of ownership. Instead, the paperwork proposed creating a family-managed preservation trust, placing operational authority under Jason and Emily to reduce stress on the principal owner. Principal owner, me, temporarily. I turned pages slowly while my pulse hammered harder beneath my ribs. Buried deeper inside were clauses granting financial decision-making authority under conditions involving health concerns, cognitive decline, or incapacity. There it was. The real target. Control. My fingers tightened slightly against the paper. "You prepared all this very quickly." Jason laughed softly. "Well, I'm an attorney." No. He'd started thinking about this long before arriving in Tuscany. I looked up calmly. And what exactly would change under this arrangement? Practically nothing, Jason assured me immediately. You'd still live here whenever you wanted. This is simply about long-term protection. Protection again. Always protection. Manipulative people love framing cages as safety. Before I could respond, Margaret appeared on the terrace wearing pale blue silk and carrying her usual aura of cultivated elegance. Perfect timing. Too perfect. "Am I interrupting?" she asked sweetly. "No," Jason replied quickly. "We were just reviewing some practical options for the estate." Margaret smiled approvingly before sitting beside me. "Heidi, darling, I know these conversations can feel uncomfortable, but at our age, refusing help becomes dangerous. Our age. Again." Margaret was only 62, 6 years younger than me, but she deliberately grouped us together whenever discussing decline. I closed the folder carefully. "And you believe I'm declining?" Margaret's expression shifted instantly into wounded concern. "Oh, goodness, no. Not currently." She touched my hand lightly. "But life changes quickly. One fall, one illness, one moment of confusion. The manipulation was almost artistic. Subtle enough to sound caring, precise enough to plant vulnerability." I suddenly remembered Sophia's voice from years earlier. Women who love too hard teach people to take them for granted. And I realized something devastating. My love for Emily had made them assume I would eventually surrender from emotional exhaustion alone. Margaret continued softly. "We only want to make sure Emily never faces legal chaos if something happens unexpectedly." Emily. Always Emily. As though motherhood required permanent self-erasure. At that exact moment, Emily herself stepped onto the terrace. Her face immediately brightened when she saw the documents. That reaction broke something inside me more than any argument had, because she knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. "Mom," she said carefully, "Jason's only trying to help." I looked directly at my daughter. "Did you know about this?" Emily hesitated, then nodded once. Yes. The betrayal hit differently this time. Cleaner, sharper. No confusion remained anymore. They had discussed my future behind closed doors before speaking to me. Margaret leaned back gracefully while watching my reaction with unsettling calm. I suddenly understood that she expected emotional collapse. Tears, guilt, maybe gratitude. Instead, I simply folded my hands together. I'd like Daniel to review everything first. The atmosphere changed immediately. Tiny shifts, but noticeable. Jason's jaw tightened slightly. Margaret's smile cooled. Emily looked nervous. Jason repeated. My attorney. Margaret laughed lightly. Oh, Heidi, surely involving outside lawyers is unnecessary between family. Outside lawyers. Interesting phrase considering she herself had likely spent decades protecting money through legal structures. I prefer caution, I replied pleasantly. Jason recovered first. Of course, he said smoothly. That's reasonable. But disappointment flickered unmistakably across his face. They thought I'd sign immediately. Because lonely older women are often expected to mistake attention for love. Unfortunately for them, Sophia DeLuca had trained me around predators far wealthier and smarter than Jason Carter. That afternoon, I carried the documents directly to Daniel in the library. He read silently for nearly 20 minutes while I paced beside the windows overlooking the vineyards. Finally, he removed his glasses slowly. Well, he said flatly, this is aggressive. My chest tightened. How bad Daniel tapped several sections sharply. These clauses create pathways toward eventual conservatorship authority under broad interpretations of diminished competency. I stared at him. You mean guardianship? Potentially, yes. A cold wave moved through my body. I sat down heavily across from him. They think I'm becoming incompetent. Daniel's expression softened slightly. No. They think they can eventually argue you are. The room suddenly felt difficult to breathe in. I remembered Margaret mentioning confusion. Falls. Illness. God. It had already started. Daniel lowered his voice. Heidi, this isn't normal estate planning. What is it? A roadmap. For what? He looked directly at me. Gradual control. I closed my eyes briefly. Every conversation suddenly rearranged itself differently inside my memory. Questions about my health, comments about aging, concern over stress, suggestions about management. They'd been constructing a narrative carefully from the moment they arrived. And the most painful part, Emily participated willingly. Not manipulated entirely, not innocent, willing. That realization hurt worse than greed itself. Because greed could be blamed on temptation. But cooperation required choice. Daniel reached into his briefcase then and removed a smaller digital recorder. From now on, he said quietly, you record every significant interaction. I stared at the device. This feels insane. No, Daniel replied calmly. This feels necessary. That evening during dinner, I watched my daughter differently. Not as the little girl who once baked cookies beside me, but as an adult woman capable of deception. The grief of that realization nearly hollowed me out. Emily chatted nervously throughout dinner while Jason acted carefully relaxed. Margaret remained composed as always, though I noticed how often her eyes drifted toward the villa itself. Not admiringly, calculatingly, like someone mentally rearranging ownership before paperwork existed. At one point, Margaret smiled toward me warmly. You know, Heidi Sophia would probably feel relieved knowing the estate could remain within family care someday. I almost dropped my wine glass, because Margaret had never met Sophia, never knew her, and yet she invoked her memory anyway to manipulate me emotionally. That was the moment I finally understood something irreversible. Margaret Whitmore wasn't merely opportunistic. She was dangerous. And unless I acted carefully, my own daughter might help her destroy everything Sophia trusted me to protect. The dinner, where everything finally collapsed, began with candles and violin music. Funny, isn't it? How disasters often arrive beautifully dressed. Margaret insisted on hosting a special family evening before everyone returned to America. She framed it as a celebration of togetherness, of healing, of new beginnings. But by then I already understood the truth. Predators become most dangerous when they believe victory is close. The courtyard looked breathtaking that night. Long tables draped in ivory linen stretched beneath strings of golden lights, while soft live violin music floated through the Tuscan air. Lucia and Antonio prepared an elaborate dinner featuring truffle pasta, roasted lamb, and wines from Sophia's oldest private reserve. Even Daniel admitted quietly, "This feels like the final scene before someone gets poisoned." I almost laughed. Almost. But tension had become so thick inside Villa Belladonna that even beauty couldn't soften it anymore. Margaret wore deep emerald silk that matched the vineyards beyond the courtyard. Emily looked pale and distracted all evening, while Jason carried himself with the controlled confidence of a man convinced he'd eventually win through persistence alone. And me. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Not passive. Not defeated. Clear. That frightened them more than tears ever would have. Dinner began politely enough. Margaret complimented Lucia's cooking. Jason discussed international markets with Daniel. Emily avoided eye contact with me almost entirely. But beneath every sentence, pressure moved quietly toward its inevitable destination. Finally, midway through dessert, Margaret lifted her wine glass delicately. "Heidi," she said warmly before we leave Tuscany, "I think it's important we settle lingering concerns as a family." There it was. The performance had begun. I set down my fork calmly. "What concerns?" Margaret smiled with practiced sadness. "We all care about you deeply." Daniel nearly choked on his wine beside me. Margaret continued gracefully. "And naturally, people who love you worry about your future. My future." Interesting how older women's futures become public property the moment wealth enters the conversation. Jason reached beside his chair and produced the leather folder again. The same one. Only this time Emily didn't look surprised. That hurt more than I expected. Jason opened the documents carefully across the candlelit table. "Heidi, these revisions simply formalize protections already discussed." Formalize protections. God. Lawyers really could make theft sound compassionate. I noticed Margaret watching me closely now, waiting, expecting emotional fatigue, maybe even surrender. Instead, I folded my napkin slowly and looked directly at Jason. "You brought legal documents to dinner." His smile tightened slightly. "We thought a relaxed family setting might make conversation easier." Family setting. As though emotional ambush became acceptable under string lights. Margaret leaned forward gently. "No one wants conflict, Heidi." Conflict? Interesting choice of word for people attempting to position themselves around my estate. Emily finally spoke, then her voice trembling slightly. "Mom, we're only trying to help." I looked at my daughter for a very long time before answering. "Help me with what exactly?" "Silence?" Jason answered instead. "With long-term stability." There's that word again. Margaret sighed softly. "Heidi, please don't become defensive." And suddenly, something inside me finally broke loose. Not my composure, my silence. I leaned back slowly in my chair beneath the glowing Tuscan lights and realized I was done protecting people who had stopped protecting me long ago. "You know," I said quietly, "the fascinating thing about manipulation is how often it disguises itself as concern." The table froze. Margaret's expression sharpened instantly. "I beg your pardon," I looked directly at her. "You arrived here asking about taxes before asking whether I was happy." Jason shifted uncomfortably. Emily whispered, "Mom." "No." My voice remained calm. "Tonight we're finally telling the truth." Margaret laughed softly. "You're being emotional." That word. Emotional. Women like Margaret always weaponized it whenever older women stopped cooperating politely. I reached beside my chair and lifted my phone onto the table. Then I pressed play. At first, only static filled the courtyard speakers connected through Antonio's small sound system. Then Margaret's voice emerged clearly into the warm night air. "Women our age must think carefully about legacy." Silence spread instantly across the table. Jason's face drained of color. Emily stared at me in horror. The recording continued. "Eventually, everyone needs trusted family handling important matters." Then another recording. Jason discussing stability and cognitive concerns. Then another. Margaret speaking about one illness and one moment of confusion. The violin music had stopped entirely now. Even the night insects seemed silent. Emily looked physically sick. "Mom," she whispered. But I wasn't finished. I reached into my bag and removed Daniel's legal analysis. These documents, I said, calmly create pathways toward eventual conservatorship authority over my estate under claims of diminished competency. Jason immediately straightened. "That's a complete distortion." "No," Daniel interrupted coldly for the first time all week. "Legally, it's extremely accurate." Margaret's elegant composure cracked slightly then. "Only slightly. But enough." "Heidi," she said carefully, "surely you don't believe your own family wishes you harm." I looked directly into her eyes. "I believe my loneliness made you assume I'd eventually sign anything to keep my daughter close." The truth landed heavily over the entire courtyard, because everyone knew it was true. Emily burst into tears suddenly. "I never wanted to hurt you." I turned toward her slowly. "Then why did you—" That question shattered something open between us. Emily covered her mouth, crying harder now, while Jason immediately moved protectively beside her. Protectively. Interesting, not remorsefully. Margaret tried regaining control instantly. "This entire situation is becoming theatrical." "No," I replied softly. "It's becoming visible." For the first time all evening, Margaret lost her smile completely. And without it, she looked colder than I'd ever seen. "You've become paranoid," she said flatly. Daniel laughed once. "Convenient diagnosis considering the paperwork." Jason suddenly stood. "Enough." His tone sharpened, now mask finally slipping. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "Yes." He gestured angrily toward the documents. "You're interpreting responsible planning as exploitation." I held his gaze steadily. "You discussed my competency before discussing my wishes." Nobody answered. Because they couldn't. Margaret attempted one final maneuver then. She turned toward Emily with wounded dignity. "You see what happens when generosity is punished. Generosity." I almost admired the audacity. That was when Emily finally looked at her differently. Not fully awake yet, but shaken, confused. For the first time, the illusion around Margaret had cracked. And Margaret knew it immediately. Her eyes hardened. Tiny shift, but unmistakable. Predators hate losing influence more than losing money. I rose slowly from the table. The warm Tuscan wind moved gently through the courtyard, while candlelight flickered across faces I suddenly saw with complete clarity. "I spent years believing love meant endless forgiveness," I said quietly. "But love without respect eventually becomes permission for cruelty." Emily sobbed openly now. Jason looked furious. Margaret looked calculating. And I no longer felt afraid of any of them. That surprised me most, because once you stop begging people to love you, they lose tremendous power over your life. I looked toward Margaret one final time. "You came to Tuscany believing I was lonely enough to surrender my judgment." Her expression remained icy. "You are lonely." The sentence hit brutally because part of it was true. But this time I didn't collapse beneath it. Instead, I smiled sadly. "Yes," I said softly. "But loneliness is still safer than being surrounded by people who mistake love for opportunity." And in the silence that followed, Margaret Whitmore finally realized she had underestimated me completely. Margaret Whitmore's mask finally fell apart at 11:43 that night. I remember the exact time because afterward I looked at the courtyard clock and realized everything had changed in less than 15 minutes. People often imagine manipulative women exploding dramatically when exposed. But Margaret didn't explode at first. She unraveled. Slowly. Elegantly. Like silk tearing under pressure. For several long seconds after my final sentence, nobody moved. The candles flickered softly between us, while warm Tuscan wind drifted through the courtyard carrying the scent of lavender and rosemary. Emily sat frozen beside Jason, tears streaking her makeup. Jason looked furious but cautious now. Lawyers understand danger instinctively, and for the first time since arriving in Tuscany, he realized the situation was no longer fully under his control. Margaret, however, became terrifyingly still. Then she laughed. Softly. Coldly. "Well," she said, lifting her wine glass with unnerving calm, "this has certainly become melodramatic." Melodramatic, as though attempted financial manipulation were simply emotional theater. I remained standing. No, it became honest. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You recorded private family conversations. You attempted to maneuver me into surrendering legal control of my estate. We attempted to protect you." "No," Daniel said sharply from beside me. "You attempted to create pathways toward conservatorship." Margaret's eyes flashed toward him. "I find it fascinating how aggressively involved you've become in family matters." Daniel smiled thinly. "I find it fascinating how invested you've become in someone else's property." That landed. Hard. The atmosphere shifted instantly, and suddenly Margaret stopped pretending. I watched it happen in real time. The warmth disappeared first, then the elegance, then the careful social performance she'd worn for years like armor. When she finally spoke again, her voice sounded completely different, colder, sharper. "You really think you're some innocent victim here?" Emily looked up immediately. "Margaret, no," Margaret snapped without looking at her. "Enough." The entire courtyard froze, because this was not the Margaret Whitmore anyone usually saw. This was the woman underneath the silk and pearls. The real one. Margaret stood slowly from the table. "You spent years deceiving your own daughter," she said flatly. "You hid wealth, property status, an entire life. I protected my privacy. You controlled the narrative." The anger in her voice shocked even Jason. Margaret stepped closer toward me. "Do you know how humiliating it was watching Emily discover her own mother had secretly been wealthier than everyone around her?" There it was again. Humiliation. Not betrayal. Not emotional hurt. Social humiliation. Everything always returned to status with Margaret. I crossed my arms calmly. "And why exactly would that humiliate you?" For the first time all evening, Margaret lost control completely. "Because people talk," she exploded. Silence slammed across the courtyard. Even Emily stared at her in shock. Margaret laughed bitterly now, pacing beside the candlelit table. "You think Manhattan society ignores things like this?" she continued. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous Emily looked? How ridiculous I looked? There it was, the real wound. Public embarrassment. Not family, not love. Reputation." Margaret turned toward Emily suddenly. "I spent years helping you build credibility in certain circles." Emily flinched visibly. "You said Mom was comfortable living quietly. You said she preferred simplicity. You said she didn't care about status." Each sentence sharpened further. "And then suddenly everyone discovers your mother owns one of the most extraordinary private estates in Tuscany." Margaret laughed harshly. "We looked like fools." I watched Emily's face carefully then. Confusion had begun turning into something deeper. Recognition. Tiny pieces of manipulation finally rearranging themselves into visible patterns. Jason stood quickly. "Margaret, stop." "No." She pointed directly toward me now. This woman sat silently while all of us were judged. I blinked slowly. Judged, yes. Margaret's voice rose further. People assumed Jason financially supported Emily because her side of the family appeared ordinary. The word hit the air again. Ordinary. Margaret's obsession with hierarchy suddenly stood naked in front of everyone. Daniel leaned back, quietly observing like a man watching a building collapse exactly as predicted. Emily whispered shakily, "Margaret, why does any of that matter?" Margaret turned toward her instantly. "Because perception matters." Emily stared at her. "No," Margaret corrected harshly. "Perception determines everything." And suddenly I saw it clearly. Margaret Whitmore was terrified. Not of losing me. not of losing family, of losing status. The villa had never represented beauty to her. It represented legitimacy, power, social survival. I spoke quietly then. "You're in financial trouble, aren't you?" The entire courtyard went silent. Margaret froze. Jason looked away immediately. And Emily? Emily slowly turned toward her mother-in-law with dawning horror. What Margaret recovered quickly. "That's absurd." But too quickly. Too defensively. Daniel finally spoke. "We ran a discreet financial review before arriving in Tuscany." Margaret's face drained slightly. "Interesting. Very interesting." Jason stood immediately. That was inappropriate. Daniel ignored him completely. "3 properties refinanced in the past 18 months," he continued calmly. "2 active lawsuits involving investment losses. Significant debt exposure through private lending." Emily looked physically ill. "Jason." Jason rubbed both hands over his face. Margaret stepped forward furiously. "How dare you investigate me? How dare you target an elderly widow's estate?" Daniel replied coldly. The silence afterward felt explosive. Then Emily turned toward Jason. You knew Jason hesitated. That hesitation destroyed whatever remained of the evening. "You knew," Emily repeated louder. Jason exhaled heavily. "It wasn't that simple." "Oh my God." Emily stumbled backward slightly, staring between them both. Margaret immediately shifted strategies. Classic manipulator. When dominance fails, become the victim. "I did everything for this family," she said emotionally. "Everything." Emily shook her head slowly. "No." Margaret's eyes filled instantly with practiced tears. "You have no idea what pressure feels like at my age. Maintaining appearances, protecting reputation." "There it is again," I interrupted quietly. Margaret snapped toward me. "What appearances?" The word echoed heavily through the courtyard. I looked directly at Emily now. "Your entire marriage became built around appearances." Emily covered her mouth, crying harder. "No." "Yes," I said softly. "You stopped caring whether people were kind. You only cared whether they looked successful. That's not true. You skipped your mother's birthday because your mother-in-law hosted a better social event." Emily collapsed into her chair, sobbing openly now. And for the first time since arriving in Tuscany, I finally saw my daughter clearly again beneath Margaret's influence. Not evil, weak, desperate for approval, terrified of exclusion. Margaret sensed control slipping instantly. "She's emotional right now," she snapped. "Don't manipulate her. Manipulate." The audacity almost impressed me. Then Margaret made her fatal mistake. She turned toward Emily sharply and said, "If you walk away from this family now, you'll destroy your entire social future." The sentence hung in the air like poison. And suddenly, Emily stopped crying. Not completely, but enough. Because finally, after years of subtle conditioning, she heard it. Not love, not concern, a transaction, social future, status, access. That was what Margaret valued most. Not Emily herself, just the usefulness of her role within Margaret's carefully curated world. Emily looked at her mother-in-law differently then. Really differently. Like someone waking from hypnosis. "You don't actually care about me," she whispered. Margaret's expression hardened instantly. "Don't be naive." There it was. The truth. Raw and ugly beneath all the elegance. Jason closed his eyes briefly as though exhausted by the inevitable collapse finally arriving. And I felt something unexpected. Not victory, grief. Because watching your child realize she built her life around manipulation isn't satisfying. It's heartbreaking. Emily looked toward me slowly then. For the first time in years, her face resembled the little girl who once sat beside me baking birthday cakes in our Boston kitchen. Lost, ashamed, human, but even then, even through the pain, I knew something important. Recognition was not redemption, and heartbreak alone would not undo the damage already done. The morning after Margaret's breakdown, Villa Belladonna felt like a house after a funeral. Too quiet. Too careful. Even the staff moved differently, speaking in hushed voices, while sunlight spread softly across the vineyards outside, as though Tuscany itself refused to acknowledge the emotional wreckage sitting inside my home. Margaret stayed in her room until nearly noon. Jason locked himself in the library, making tense phone calls to New York. And Emily wandered the estate alone like a ghost. Twice I saw her standing near the western vineyard where Sophia used to walk at sunset. Once she sat beside the fountain for almost an hour, staring at nothing while tears rolled silently down her face. A younger version of me would have rushed toward her immediately, comforted her, protected her from pain. But motherhood becomes dangerous when compassion exists without boundaries. I understood that now. Around lunchtime, Daniel found me in the garden pruning roses. "She wants to speak with you," he said quietly. I didn't ask which woman. I already knew. Emily waited for me beneath the pergola overlooking the hills. She looked exhausted, eyes swollen from crying, hair unbrushed, yesterday's confidence completely stripped away. For the first time in years, she resembled my daughter more than Margaret Whitmore's carefully polished protégé. When I sat across from her, she immediately began crying again. "I don't even know who I became." The sentence broke my heart instantly. But heartbreak and accountability must sometimes exist together. I folded my hands calmly. "You became someone who confused approval with love." Emily lowered her head. "I didn't realize how bad it was." "Yes," I said softly. "You did." She looked up sharply. "No, Mom. I swear you knew enough." The truth settled painfully between us, because this was the part people rarely admit about manipulation. It only works long-term when part of you benefits from believing it. Emily benefited from Margaret's world. The status, the exclusivity, the feeling of elevation. Margaret didn't force Emily to abandon me entirely. She simply rewarded her each time she did. Emily whispered shakily, "I thought if I finally fit into their world, I'd stop feeling insecure." I studied my daughter carefully. "When did you start feeling insecure?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "When I realized everyone around Jason judged where I came from." There it was. The wound beneath everything. Shame. Emily wiped tears from her cheeks. Margaret always knew exactly what to say. She'd compliment me 1 minute, then casually mention women who married into powerful families and embarrassed themselves because they didn't understand elite culture. Emily shook her head slowly. After a while, I started hearing her voice constantly in my head. I closed my eyes briefly. God, that was exactly how women like Margaret operated. Not through open cruelty, through conditioning. Tiny humiliations repeated until insecurity becomes self-policing. Emily looked at me desperately now. "I know I hurt you." "Yes," I said quietly. "And I know saying sorry isn't enough." "No," I replied. "It isn't." Silence followed. Painful. Necessary. Then Emily whispered the question I knew was coming. "What happens now?" I leaned back slowly, looking out across Sophia's vineyards, glowing gold beneath the afternoon sun. For years, I would have answered differently. I would have rushed to repair everything immediately, reassured her, protected her from consequences. But age teaches women something important eventually. Love without self-respect becomes self-destruction. So instead, I told the truth. What happens now depends entirely on whether you want healing or access. Emily flinched like I'd slapped her. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Tears filled her eyes again. "I'm your daughter, and you still helped them prepare legal pathways to control my estate. I didn't understand what Jason was doing." "You understood enough to stay quiet." The words hurt both of us. I could see it. But truth often hurts before it heals. Emily covered her face briefly. "I hate who I became." "No," I said softly. "You hate seeing yourself clearly." She stared at me, and for the first time since Tuscany began unraveling everything, I saw genuine humility in her eyes. Not performance. Not manipulation. Fear. The fear of realizing you damaged someone who loved you unconditionally. A long silence passed before I finally spoke again. I'm not giving you the villa. Emily looked down immediately, not surprised. Maybe not even disappointed, just ashamed. I know. I'm not transferring ownership, not creating trusts, not handing management authority to Jason. At Jason's name, Emily visibly stiffened, then quietly said, I don't think there's going to be a marriage anymore. I inhaled slowly. Oddly, I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. Only sadness. Because losing illusions still hurts even when the illusions were toxic. Emily twisted her wedding ring nervously. He's furious with me. For what? For not defending them last night? Her laugh sounded hollow now. Margaret says I betrayed the family. Family. Funny word coming from a woman who weaponized belonging. I looked at my daughter carefully. And what do you think? Emily's voice trembled. I think I betrayed the wrong person years ago. That sentence nearly undid me. Nearly. But healing required more than emotional clarity during crisis. It required change. Real change. I leaned forward slightly. If you truly want a relationship with me again, there will be conditions. Emily nodded immediately. Anything. No. I shook my head slowly. Not anything. Accountability. She went quiet. First I said calmly therapy. Emily blinked. What? You heard me. Mom, I'm not. You spent years allowing another woman to reshape your identity through insecurity and social manipulation. My voice remained steady. That doesn't happen without deeper wounds underneath it. Emily stared at the table silently. Second, I continued absolute honesty. No more performances. No more pretending appearances matter more than integrity. A tear slid down her cheek. And third, I held her gaze. You separate your life from people who treat love like currency. Emily understood immediately. Margaret and Jason. Silence. Heavy silence. Because now came the real choice. Not emotion. Action. Emily looked toward the vineyards for a long time before whispering, I don't know who I am without them. That sentence shattered me more than anything else she'd said. Because underneath all the cruelty, all the ambition, all the betrayal, my daughter had become emotionally dependent on people who only valued her conditionally. I reached across the table then and touched her hand for the first time in days. You were someone before them. Emily burst into tears again. Not dramatic tears this time. Childlike ones. The kind that come when a person finally stops defending themselves. At that exact moment, Jason appeared near the terrace doors carrying luggage. He looked furious. Not heartbroken. Furious. Margaret followed behind him in immaculate cream clothing, despite the emotional destruction surrounding us. Even now, she remained perfectly composed again. Mask restored. Jason stopped near the pergola. We're leaving. Emily stood slowly. Margaret's gaze moved toward her immediately. Come on, darling. Darling, still claiming ownership. Emily looked between them, then toward me. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. This moment would shape the rest of her life, not emotionally, morally. Jason's voice hardened. Emily. Margaret remained quieter, more strategic. You don't abandon your family because of one emotional misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. God. Emily's shoulders trembled. Then slowly, very slowly, she removed her wedding ring. Jason stared at her in disbelief. Margaret's face went completely cold. I can't do this anymore, Emily whispered. And for the first time since arriving in Tuscany, my daughter chose truth over appearances, even though it cost her everything she built her adult identity around. Jason laughed once bitterly before turning away. Margaret looked at Emily with pure contempt now. Not grief, not love, contempt. Because usefulness had ended. And in that moment, Emily finally saw the horrifying truth clearly. Margaret Whitmore never loved her. Only the version of her that maintained the image Margaret needed. 6 months later, Tuscany smelled like rosemary rain and new beginnings. Spring had returned to Villa Belladonna, slowly covering the hills in soft green light, while vineyards stretched endlessly beneath skies so blue they almost looked painted. Life at the villa became quieter after Margaret and Jason left. Cleaner somehow. Not easier. Healing rarely feels easy, but honest. Daniel returned to Boston shortly after the confrontation. Though we spoke often, Lucia resumed arguing lovingly with Antonio over olive oil and harvest schedules. The staff gradually stopped whispering whenever Emily's name appeared. And Emily disappeared for nearly 11 weeks. At first I thought she had chosen Jason after all. Part of me even expected it, because leaving manipulation behind sounds noble in emotional moments, but real change becomes terrifying once consequences arrive. And consequences arrived quickly. Jason filed for separation within a month. Margaret publicly blamed Emily for destroying the family through instability. Several social circles Emily once fought desperately to impress quietly excluded her almost overnight. Funny how conditional communities disappear the moment usefulness ends. During those 11 weeks, Emily sent only 3 messages. Not dramatic ones, not manipulative ones. Simple, honest. The first read, "I started therapy today." The second, "I'm beginning to realize how much of my life was performance." And the third simply said, "I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small." I didn't answer immediately, not because I wanted punishment, because trust regrows slowly after being broken repeatedly. Then one rainy Thursday morning in April, Lucia entered the breakfast room smiling strangely. "She's here." My heart stopped instantly. I looked up from my coffee. Who? Lucia crossed her arms knowingly. "You know who." Through the rain-streaked windows, I saw a taxi parked outside the villa gates, and standing beside it was Emily, alone. No designer luggage, no Jason, no Margaret, just my daughter standing beneath gray Tuscan rain looking terrified. For several seconds I couldn't move. Then slowly I walked outside. The rain smelled soft and earthy against the vineyards, while Emily stood frozen near the entrance road clutching a small overnight bag. When she saw me, tears filled her eyes immediately. But this time, she didn't rush forward dramatically, didn't perform grief. She simply stood there honestly. "I almost turned around 3 times, she admitted shakily. I stopped a few feet away from her. "You came anyway." Emily nodded, then looked directly at me. "I didn't come for the villa." The sentence mattered because she understood it needed to be said first. Not defensively, truthfully. "I know." Rainwater slid through her hair while she struggled visibly to steady herself. "I spent most of my life thinking love had to be earned through approval," she whispered. Therapy made me realize something horrifying. I remained silent. Emily laughed bitterly through tears. "I became exactly the kind of person you tried to protect me from." God. Hearing her say it aloud nearly broke me. She wiped at her eyes quickly. "I kept thinking about your birthday." Her voice cracked. "About you sitting alone while I worried about appearances." The shame in her face looked genuine now. Not performative, not socially polished. Real remorse carries a different weight entirely. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued quietly. "I just couldn't keep living without telling you the truth." I folded my arms against the cool spring rain. What truth? Emily looked directly at me. I loved being chosen by powerful people more than I valued being loved honestly. The sentence hit with brutal precision, because it explained everything. Not greed alone, validation. Margaret had offered Emily access to exclusivity status, social elevation, all the things insecure people mistake for self-worth. And slowly my daughter sacrificed authenticity to keep belonging. Emily's shoulders trembled. When Dad died, I think part of me became terrified of being vulnerable or ordinary again. She swallowed hard. Margaret made me feel protected from that. I closed my eyes briefly. Robert. Even years later, grief still echoed quietly through our lives, in ways neither of us fully understood. Emily looked toward the vineyards, but eventually I realized something. Tears slid down her face again. Nobody in that world actually loved each other. No. They traded usefulness. Very different thing. The rain softened around us while silence stretched gently between mother and daughter. Finally, Emily whispered, "You loved me when I had nothing impressive to offer." And there it was. The understanding she'd spent years running from. Real love does not require performance. I stepped closer slowly. Not enough to erase the past. Just enough to soften the distance. "Healing takes time," I said quietly. "I know. I still don't trust you completely." Emily nodded immediately. "I know, and some damage never disappears entirely." Her face crumpled slightly. "I know." But she stayed. Didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. That mattered too. Lucia eventually opened the villa doors behind us. "You two are getting pneumonia for emotional symbolism," she announced loudly. Emily laughed unexpectedly through tears. The sound startled both of us, because for the first time in years, her laughter sounded real again. That evening we sat together in Sophia's old library while rain tapped softly against the windows. No dramatic speeches, no instant reconciliation, just honesty. Emily told me therapy forced her to confront years of insecurity and emotional dependency. She admitted how much she'd prioritized external approval over genuine connection. "I spent years trying to become someone impressive," she whispered. I looked around the library filled with ancient books and restored paintings. "And did it make you happy?" Emily shook her head slowly. "No." A small broken smile appeared. "It made me perform happiness." That line stayed with me long afterward. Perform happiness. How many women spend entire lives doing exactly that? Weeks passed, then months. Slowly, carefully, Emily began rebuilding herself differently. Not perfectly, but honestly. She found work with a nonprofit arts foundation in Florence instead of returning to Manhattan marketing circles. She continued therapy. She apologized without demanding immediate absolution. Most importantly, she stopped treating love like a negotiation. One warm June evening, nearly a year after my terrible birthday in Boston, Villa Belladonna hosted another celebration. But this time, it wasn't for me alone. Together, Emily and I officially launched the Belladonna Foundation for Women, a program supporting older women abandoned, manipulated, or financially exploited by family members. The idea came after Lucia quietly admitted how many widows in nearby villages lived isolated lives after children moved away or treated them like burdens. "We create places where women are still seen," Emily said during the opening speech. Seen. The word nearly made me cry, because invisibility had been the deepest wound beneath everything all along. As sunset spread gold across the Tuscan hills, I stood beside my daughter, overlooking the vineyards Sophia once loved. Emily slipped her arm gently through mine. Not possessively, not performatively, just lovingly. "I'm still ashamed sometimes," she admitted quietly. I looked toward the glowing hills. "Good," I said softly. She blinked in surprise. Then I smiled faintly. "Shame means your conscience survived." Emily laughed softly. Real laughter again. And standing there beneath the Tuscan sunset, I finally understood something that took me nearly 70 years to learn. Being loved conditionally may feel glamorous for a while. But being loved honestly, that is the rarest wealth of all. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak in life does not come from strangers. It comes from the people we once believed would never stop choosing us. As parents, especially as mothers, we spend so many years sacrificing quietly that we begin to believe love means enduring anything without complaint. We excuse disrespect. We tolerate neglect. We wait endlessly for appreciation that may never come. But one of the most important lessons in life is this: love should never require you to disappear in order to keep it. Heidi's story reminds us that loneliness can make people accept crumbs when they deserve a full table. It also reminds us that wealth is not what changes people, it reveals them. Some people only value others when status, power, or money become visible. But real love exists long before success is seen. Real love sits beside you when there is nothing to gain. At the same time, this story is also about redemption. Emily made terrible choices, but healing only began when she stopped defending herself and finally faced the truth. That is a lesson for all of us. Pride destroys relationships, but honesty can rebuild them slowly, one painful truth at a time. And perhaps the most powerful message of all is that it is never too late to reclaim your worth. Whether you are 30, 60, or 80, your life still belongs to you. You are still allowed to choose peace over manipulation, dignity over approval, and truth over appearances. Sometimes the moment you stop begging people to love you is the exact moment you finally remember how to love yourself. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt taken for granted by someone you loved deeply? Or have you ever had to rebuild a relationship after betrayal? I would truly love to hear your story. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas with meaningful life lessons, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing these journeys together.